How long you need to prepare for an emergency is one of the most venomous debates in preparedness. But the overwhelming majority of people are way overdoing it in some areas and way underdoing it in the areas that matter most. So let's get after it. I'm James Merritt, emergency manager and career soldier, and this is Readiness Nation. So the subject of how long you need to prepare for is one of the most hotly contested subjects in the preparedness space. And a lot of folks go wrong by just hoarding as much crap as they can with no real plan. Now, every time I say that, there's a portion of the internet that gets really upset. But for the most part, I'm not seeing people tying the kit that they're hoarding to actual operational needs. Now, if you're collecting for fun, do what makes you happy. But if you want to be successful in real-life emergencies, you need to analyze your situation, make a plan that addresses your circumstances and hazards, cultivate the skills to successfully execute your plan, and then gather the materials that support your skills. So even if you don't like what I lay out in my planning framework and you want to do your own thing, it's critical that you have a complete plan and are developing your capabilities needs based on the requirements to support that plan. But in this video, I'm going to lay everything out in the context of the Individual Readiness Framework, which is a scalable, modular, all-hazards planning framework that I developed from 5,000 to 6,000 pages of Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security doctrine. The Individual Readiness Framework begins with Phase 0, which is your planning and preparation phase. And as such, this is when you do your planning, not a phase you're planning for, aside from your prevention and mitigation measures. But that's a whole different set of videos. So when we're talking about planning horizons for your various classes of supply, Phase 1 is where we really begin. Phase 1 is about getting from wherever you are when the emergency begins back to your home, or primary location. I further break Phase 1 into subphases Alpha and Bravo. Subphase 1 Alpha is about getting from wherever you're standing when the emergency begins back to your vehicle. I talk about the planning considerations for this in my video, The Definitive Answer for EDC. Subphase 1 Bravo is about getting from your vehicle back to your house. Everything you could need to make that movement should be staged in your trunk cache. And with any luck, you'll be able to make that movement in your vehicle, and the movement doesn't take any longer than your regular commute time. And whereas we always hope for the best case scenario, we always plan for the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is that you'll need to make that movement on foot. As such, the planning horizon is however long it would take you to walk home from the furthest location you regularly travel to in daily life. Phase 2 is about sheltering or defending in place at your house. And this is where things get controversial. At an absolute minimum, to be a responsible adult, you must have at least 3 days of supply on hand. Meaning you can fully self-subsist without any utilities or any stores being open. This 72-hour planning horizon is based on the fact that it'll take 72 hours for the government to have a full-fledged response in place. When I was in the National Guard, I was in the state's Emergency Response Battalion. And our standard was that the Quick Reaction Force Company had to be anywhere in the state in 24 hours. And the whole battalion needed to be anywhere in the state in 72 hours. So you shouldn't expect any help for at least 72 hours after a major incident. And no matter who you are or how much you're into this stuff, you need to be able to fully take care of yourself and your family for at least that long without any outside help. That 72 hours used to be the standard put out by FEMA. But after COVID, they're reassessing and have come to the conclusion that regular citizens should actually keep 2 weeks of supply on hand. This was discussed when I was at FEMA Academy, but I haven't seen that the published doctrine is caught up yet. This is a far more reasonable planning horizon, as the overwhelming majority of emergencies that disrupt utilities are resolved within 2 weeks. Now, if you live in a remote area, it can, and usually does, take longer to fix things. So plan accordingly. Now, going past this 2-week planning horizon is totally at your discretion. And when I talk about the planning horizon for Phase 4, we'll talk about balancing Phases 2 and 4. However, your Phase 2 planning horizon should not exceed 6 months. There's no emergency we've recovered from where we weren't able to restore the basic functioning of society within 6 months. Now, when I say basic functioning, I don't mean everything is fully back to normal. It took New Orleans 17 years to get everything fully back to normal after Hurricane Katrina. By basic functioning, I mean the rule of law is holding, first responders and emergency services are operating, all of your utilities are functioning, the banks are open and have cash, and the grocery stores, drugstores, and gas stations are all open and relatively well stocked. So I mean all of the things that normal people need to actually live in an area are functional again. All of New Orleans met this standard within 6 months after Katrina, and any place we're planning on reoccupying can meet this standard within 6 months. If we can't meet this standard within 6 months, it either means the area has been abandoned and thus will never recover, or if the state and federal governments are unable to restore the basic functioning of society within a region, it's because we're looking at a full collapse event. In either instance, you'll need to displace to a secondary location and start a new life. Which brings us to Phase 3, which is about making movement from your primary to secondary locations. But one last point about Phase 2 before we move on. Now do bear in mind if you don't think it's necessary or you don't find it feasible given your circumstances to build past Phase 2, being able to fully self-secure and self-subsist for up to 6 months without any outside help will cover you for about 90% of what can go wrong. So don't feel bad if Phases 0 through 2 are all you can manage. Moving on to Phase 3, similarly to Phase 1, the planning horizon is how long it would take you to walk from your primary to secondary locations, because there's a lot of scenarios in which you'd need to make this movement on foot. So the distance from your primary to secondary locations being a distance you could realistically walk is critical to your operational success. The logistic and physiological burdens start to get onerous after about 10 days, so I strongly recommend that you be able to complete this foot movement in no more than 2 weeks. Phase 4 is where you go into the strongest defensive posture that you can at your secondary location while the world dies. I talk about the particulars of this in my video, How the World Actually Ends, but government assessments are that 2/3 to 90% of the population of the US will die off within the first year after a full collapse event. So Phase 4 starts with you getting to your secondary location and ends with you getting to your first harvest and living off of your own agricultural production. So this is the part I was talking about before where you need to balance your planning horizons for Phases 2 and 4. What I mean by this is that your cumulative resources for Phases 2 and 4 need to see you through the year of mass die-off, then through your first planting season, and on to your first harvest. So altogether, this needs to be 30 months of supply. 12 months for the world to die, and because you don't know what time of year this is all going to happen, 18 months to make sure that you're covered until the next viable planting season and through to its harvest. So you can split those 30 months of supply between your primary and secondary locations in whatever way makes the most sense for your circumstances. If you rent an apartment or condo in an urban area for employment opportunities for yourself or your spouse, or educational opportunities for your kids, it would make sense to only keep 2 weeks of supply on hand at your primary location to cover you for minor disruption events. And then keep everything else, the homestead you own, 150 miles outside of town. Conversely, if you're a farmer currently or you already live on a homestead, assuming you can effectively secure your land, Phases 2 and 4 get merged together and you'd keep all 30 months of supply at your one and only location. If you can afford it, a little more cushion as crop insurance isn't a bad idea. But I wouldn't exceed 5 years of supply. At that point, you'll be well past the mass die-off and your money is far better spent on enhancing your productive capabilities in Phase 5. And Phase 5 begins once you've brought in your first harvest and ends with you dying peacefully in your bed some decades from now, having successfully seen your family through the collapse of civilization. But to get to that happy ending, you need to understand that Phase 5 takes developing a whole new way of life. The most important thing I need to get the public to understand is that the only way that anyone is surviving a full collapse event in the long term is if they can engage in subsistence agriculture, meaning that each family is able to produce all the food they need to survive themselves on their own property without needing any outside help or resources. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't help your neighbors, but in the immediate aftermath, no one is going to have enough to carry anyone else. And it's not until all of the people who are engaged in subsistence agriculture are producing agricultural surplus consistently that we'll be able to support specialized labor again. Even if you're a doctor and people are willing to pay for your services, they need to be producing enough to be able to pay for your services without starving to death. And there needs to be enough people with the ability to pay consistently for you to be able to make your living doing anything but farming. So without the agricultural economic foundation of civilization being relaid, civilization will never be rebuilt. And nothing ever gets better for anyone. So it's not just about you being able to provide for your family, it's literally about you doing your part to rebuild civilization. And it's only families that can go back to the land that have a shot. As such, if you're preparing for a full collapse event, the majority of your efforts and resources need to be dumped into your post-apocalyptic way of life. You'll need to learn how and have the tools and supplies to produce everything you're going to need for the rest of your life. And figure out what surplus you're going to want to produce for trade to try to get the things you want for the rest of your life. Furthermore, you're going to need to be able to produce all these goods from things you can reliably produce yourself, like making candles from beeswax, clothes or blankets from rabbit fur or goat leather, or soap from rendered animal fat. Surviving and rebuilding civilization in post-apocalyptia will overwhelmingly not be about gunfights after the first year. It'll be about living like our ancestors, resettling the land, and rebuilding industry. This process will take decades, if not generations, to complete. So it's not physically possible to hoard enough supplies to see you through the whole thing. And even if it was possible, you not producing anything would mean you're doing nothing to rebuild civilization. And then, nothing ever gets better. So in conclusion, plan for however long it takes to make all of your movements on foot. Plan to be able to defend and fully self-subsist in place at your primary and secondary locations for a combined total of 30 months. But most of your time, effort, and resources should be put into how you plan on living in post-apocalyptia, because that's going to last you the rest of your life. But that's going to be it for me. So if you found this information useful, give me the old controlled pair on the like and subscribe buttons. And if you found this information useful enough that you want to buy me a beer about it, there's a link to my Patreon and Subscribestar in the description. So until next time, this is James Merritt for Readiness Nation, reminding you to always be the master of your fate and the captain of your soul.